Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Dying Your Way podcast. I am so happy to introduce to you today Dr. Marjorie Woollacott. Marjorie is a neuroscience, and she is a tenured professor at the University of Oregon, I believe, and you've been there for 3 decades. And you have been a committed and dedicated meditator for 4 decades. One of the things that I love about Marjorie, and I hope you don't mind me calling you Marjorie, but this is an amazing woman who has dedicated her life to science, to neuroscience specifically. And she has written a book called Infinite Awareness, The Awakening of the Scientific Mind. And this is a book that shatters a lot of firm beliefs that are held by scientists and by spiritual believers as well. It's an incredible bridge between the two based on science. And she doesn't say what people want to hear as much as what is provable in the realm of neuroscience. And I want for a moment our listeners to suspend any kind of preconceived notions or beliefs that you have, any spiritual dogma or any fixed scientific beliefs. Just let that go just for this conversation. Just consider life after death with an open mind. And with that, I would very much like to welcome and open up a conversation with Dr. Marjorie Woollacott. Marjorie, welcome.
Thank you, Claire.
So glad you're here. There's just so much that we could cover, and I want you to have the freedom to share with this audience, really what you think is pertinent. And there are a lot of different types of people that listen to this podcast. There are people that are patients, there are people that are family members, there are people that are professionals, early planners. There may be a neuroscientist or two that are out there, but probably not. So anyway, just why don't you start by just giving us an overview of your work and and where the focus of your work is right now in your life.
Sure. So first of all, I was trained as a neuroscientist in rehabilitation medicine, and I worked with persons with stroke and Parkinson's disease, and also children with cerebral palsy. And I've published a textbook in rehabilitation and written a variety of papers in that area. And I think the most important thing is, like other neuroscientists, when I began my research, I had the view that human awareness was solely the product of the activity of neurons in our brain. I was basically a materialist scientist. Mm-hmm. But then early in my career, my sister invited me to a meditation retreat. And in that first meditation session of the retreat, I had an experience of awareness that was much more expansive than anything I had experienced before. I began to feel this energy pulsating from the core of my being, and it was radiating outward, and it felt like nectar. It felt like pure love and joy pouring out of me. And it felt like I was being awakened to a new way of seeing the world. And with it, this came a feeling of powerful connection with other people and with all the things around me. And I went back home and began meditating every day because it was so satisfying. Mm-hmm. But at first, I didn't know how to put those two perspectives together, this neuroscientist viewpoint that I'd had all of my youth in my career, and now this new understanding as a meditator. And there was a separation between those two worldviews that I didn't know how to really bridge. And in fact, my book, Infinite Awareness, is really about how I began to do research to expand my own scientific view of consciousness and to integrate it into the experiences that I have begun to have in meditation. So the first thing I did is I began to do research in my laboratory on meditation and what changes in the brain when we meditate. And like a lot of other scientists, I found that meditation makes our mind more agile, and we're better able to focus, and our perception becomes much more subtle. And we regulate our emotions better, that sort of thing. But this kind of research didn't really answer my true question, and that was, is there more to human consciousness than just brain activity? Wow. So it led me to examine the research exploring phenomena that many people report, but that science doesn't take seriously. like energy healing, like end of life, and also near-death experiences. And I was surprised to find carefully designed and controlled studies by scientists at major universities and medical centers published in peer-reviewed journals showing that consciousness is not necessarily tied to brain activity. So I never had heard of these before is because I, as a neuroscientist, had blinders on. And now I saw that there was much more research out there than I'd ever been aware of.
So I'm going to ask you just the most elementary question. It's kind of like the chicken or the egg conversation. So what comes first? I mean, does the mind creating consciousness come first, or does consciousness creating the mind come first? Is there a scientific answer to that?
And I think there is. And I think, first of all, that consciousness comes first, creating the mind. And I'll tell you some of the research as we go along, but I think that I see consciousness as vast and limitless, like a vibrant awareness that exists beyond time and space, and that our brain is a filter. It's like this partial barrier to experiencing that consciousness fully. And I believe we tap into this vast consciousness to varying degrees in various times in our lives, like when we meditate, for example, or when we're near death, because we have that basically the equivalent of the semi-permeable boundary between our limited consciousness of our brains and this wider consciousness. And sometimes we go through that semi-permeable boundary. Mm. So I think the brain and the sense organs are not the source of all our mental experience, but they act as a filter. And they're literally receiving and filtering information from this independent vast consciousness. And here's an interesting point that I like to make. Evolutionarily, this could be considered a very adaptive strategy to allow us basically to be aware of the most relevant stimuli for our survival in this world. And there's this vast amount of information that's available to us. And if we had all of it available to us, we wouldn't be able to function normally. So in fact, the brain filters everything down so that we can function well in this physical world.
Yeah, I've heard that before. That is just interesting. There is a story that I've heard you talk about that's somewhat personal, but if you don't mind, I'd like you to share it with the audience about Dr. Bettina Payton and what her real life experience was verifiable in your opinion. And I think it would be really useful and inspiring to hear.
Yeah, so again, this is the experience of Dr. Bettina Payton, who was a physician and an MD, basically doing work in general medicine, when she had a near-death experience during the birth of her third child. And she was an avowed atheist when this happened. And she said she went into cardiac arrest as the doctors were actually doing a cesarean section to deliver that third child. She was under anesthesia with her eyes taped shut to protect their corneas when she suddenly became wide awake, and she heard the anesthesiologist say, "Her blood pressure is plummeting fast." Now, at that point, she says she became aware of a very strange stillness spreading through her chest, and she realized something was missing. It was her heartbeat. And at the same time, she says her vision opened and she discovered she could see into the room. She could basically see all the things around her, including the drip system going down into her own body as they were dripping fluids into her body. Now, she says the cardiac monitor just then registered the lack of her heartbeat with these loud beeps. And she saw the anesthesiologist slam his fist into the wall, basically to this bright red button to call a code to get all of the resuscitation team to actually come and help resuscitate her. And at this point, she says she felt she was about to die. And she said that in her inner vision, she felt this vast darkness expanding behind her in the backmost boundaries of her mind. She said she felt herself leaning backwards and falling, like gliding downward in this graceful backward arc into the unknown. She says the darkness was vividly black with particles of sparkling light. And she said she felt a pervasive presence in that light, this pulsating power. And she said she was completely happy. She was enveloped in peace. And then she heard these words, "You must live." And she said suddenly she was funneling down through the darkness back into that operating room where she had been before. And she just then saw the members of this resuscitation team burst through the double swinging doors into the operating room to see their colleague's lifeless body on the table. And she said she then watched later as the senior surgeon entered the room. He reached into her blood-filled abdomen and they found the aorta. He wrapped his fingers around it and then clamped his hand shut so that her bleeding would be stopped and her heart would begin to beat again. And when she said she opened her eyes in the recovery room, she was surrounded by her husband, who was a doctor, and the rest of the team of doctors and nurses. And she still had a trachea tube in her throat, so she couldn't speak, but she motioned to them not to say anything, and she asked for something to write on. And then she wrote on a napkin they gave to her words to this effect: "I know I have a baby girl. I know my uterus is out, and I know my heart stopped." And she said later she had conversations with the personnel that were in that delivery room, verifying everything that had happened, that she had seen under anesthesia in cardiac arrest with her eyes taped shut. And so I say, if that's the case, how could the brain possibly be the sole source of our conscious experience? That's the real question.
And why that story is just so amazing to me is that what effect that must have had on the medical professionals that were part of that team, and the disbelief that is kind of inherent in a scientific mind of the ability for the mind to function outside of the body, and the spirit or the soul, whatever you want to call it. And then on the other hand of that there are spiritual believers that are fixed in their spiritual beliefs about how, the end of life is for some and for not the same for others, that it just kind of makes me look at both sides of that coin and go, we really need to look at death and dying in a completely different way. And I love the work that you're doing and how that's anecdote, if you want to call it an anecdote, really speaks to the scientific value of knowing that there's something beyond that last breath. Did she technically die?
She technically died. I mean, basically, she was without any cardiac heartbeat for a very, very long time. Now, people say that if you are resuscitated, then you can't have truly died because you're resuscitated. But I also want to say that something interesting about that experience for her was that she, of course, changed her understanding after she woke up in the recovery room, and she said, I now knew that consciousness was primary, it was fundamental. And she shifted her work in hospital care to hospice care to help people who were dying, because she had no fear of death anymore. And she wanted to share that with the patients and the families that were in hospice care. And she said when she walked into a room, people knew that she had no fear of death. That lack of fear could be felt, and it changed everything.
Amazing. I love that story, and I'm so glad that you've shared that with us. One of the things that I also read in your work, my mother died of Alzheimer's in 2010. And, I write a lot about that experience, that caretaking experience. And it was really powerful for me. But you wrote something that I was like, I wish I would have known this when I was taking care of her, because there was, if I understand it correctly, even that people that have a debilitating stroke, people that are in a coma, people with different kinds of dementia, even people that obviously are flatlining, have a level of consciousness that is measurable, is, maybe I'm not even using that word, but doesn't there need to be some kind of paradigm shift really in how all of these patients that seemingly are unconscious, can't hear, can't be aware, it just seems to me like there needs to be some kind of big shift in how the medical community approaches, and carers, home community, taking care of these patients. Could you?
Yes, Yeah, I agree with you. And so I think that the answer is yes, there needs to be a paradigm shift. And I think it's because when we know that even people with debilitating strokes, for example, or comas or dementia, have a level of consciousness that's measurable, we need to really treat these people and interact with them as if they are truly the sacred beings that they are, the truly aware beings underneath those issues that we see on the surface. And what I want to say is that one of the reasons that we now know that is the case is through what we call terminal lucidity, which is when somebody who has dementia or a coma comes back in the last hours of their life to total lucidity and says goodbye to their family.
Yeah.
And I just want to give one example and then just talk about what that really means. And the example is of a 5-year-old boy, and he was dying from a malignant brain tumor. Now, he'd been in a coma for about 3 weeks, constantly surrounded by his family. And finally, on the advice of their minister, the family told this comatose child that they would miss him, but it was okay for him to die.
Mm-hmm.
And suddenly, unexpectedly, he gained consciousness. He thanked the family for letting him go, and he told them he'd be dying soon. And he died the next day. So he heard them in the coma. He then comes out of the coma and says goodbye. And this is something that medical personnel don't understand. And I have another example I think that's also amazing. It's of a 91-year-old woman who actually had 2 strokes, and her second stroke completely paralyzed her, and she now had no speech. And her daughter says she was with her just before the woman died, and she said she heard her mother exclaim something. She smiled brightly, she turned her head, and she sat up in bed, and she raised her arms joyously, and she said her husband's name, and then her arms dropped, and she sank back, and she died. And now from a materialist perspective, as a neuroscientist, it doesn't seem possible that a nervous system that was non-functioning could do that, but this happened right before the woman died. So one thing I like about these stories is that people are beginning to do research in the area. And one man that's doing the research is named Alexander Battiani from the University of Vienna. And he's asked physicians and other healthcare workers to actually look at people in hospice care, for example, during the last many years, to say how many people, for example, that had dementia or a stroke or a coma actually had terminal lucidity. And he found out that about 10% of those people actually come back to total lucidity, usually within the last 24 hours of their life, and usually for about 30 minutes to an hour. And they say goodbye to their family in this beautiful way. And what I think is interesting, and here's just, again, one more example that I love. There was this elderly woman who had dementia, and she was totally mute. She didn't recognize people anymore, but unexpectedly one day, she calls her daughter from the nursing home where she is, and she thanks her daughter for everything.
On the phone, or calls
On
her?
the phone. She calls the daughter on the phone, and she lets the grandchildren get on the phone, and she has this warm conversation with the grandchildren full of kindness. And then she says farewell, and shortly afterwards, she dies. So one of the interesting things for me, speaking of healthcare changes, is that one caregiver, when this happened to her, said that now I understand that I'm caring for nurslings of immortality. And I only wish I had known this earlier. I would have really cared for these patients in a totally different way.
Yeah, yeah. You know, when my father was dying, he was very lucid. I mean, he didn't have Alzheimer's or any kind of dementia. He had everything else wrong with him, but he was watching the Cowboys play football, and about halfway through the game, he was just like, well, sweet, I'm ready to go to bed now. Let's just get me in bed. I helped him into his bed, and he pretty much went into a coma and started the death rattle that night. And I was calling hospice, and they were telling me what to do. And that morning, and I was, on the couch in the next room the whole time. And the next morning, he was just alert, and he was like, "Oh, sweet! Do you see Sloan and Freddie?" And he started naming all of these relatives that he was pointing to the corner of the room. "Do you see him? Do you see him?" And I was like, "I don't, but I believe you do." And he just kind of laughed and chuckled, and then he went back into the coma. And about 1 a.m. that night, so maybe like 14 hours later, he passed away. But it was, I don't know if that would fall into the terminal lucidity category, but he definitely saw people on the other side. And I love to compare birth to death.
Yeah.
And how, when babies are born, they are often like having conversations with people that we don't see. I mean, their attention is going somewhere, and it just feels like that the beginning of life and the end of life have a lot of similarities. And I don't know if that's ever been scientifically studied at all,
It
but
has. Yeah, I mean, in fact, one of the people that's doing research right now is a man named Dr. Christopher Kerr, and he is a physician in hospice and palliative care in New York, in the United States. And what he has begun to do is to look at the end of life experience from the patient's perspective rather than just the physician's perspective. And he's been carefully interviewing these people about their dreams and their visions during the last weeks of their life. And just like you were saying with your own dad, that these people have dreams that they're very, very often of either deceased family members or friends that have died or pets that have died, and they come to them in the dreams. And they're these wonderful, welcoming dreams very, very often. And they say that the dreams make these people feel so comforted. There's no concern, no terror, nothing like that. It's like, they're going to be there to greet me, and they've already come in this way. And he said that this happens in something like, I think, 3/4 of these patients that are in hospice care in those last weeks of their life.
Mm.
One other thing I also wanted to mention is that there's a woman from Switzerland, Monica Renz is her name, and she's also looked at cancer patients that are in these terminal phases of their life. And she says something very interesting happens to about half of the patients, and that is that they go from what she calls an ego-centered perspective, where they're focused on their story of their life and their struggles, to what she calls an ego-distancing perspective, where suddenly they're not concerned with those struggles and stories anymore, and they relax into this place of being and of peacefulness. And she said it's so beautiful to watch this transition where suddenly they feel more of this unity with things around them as they move into this place of tranquility. And that's very often then how they pass. And I think, wow, if I could have that now, I would want that. I want my ego distancing now.
That I've observed that so many times in people that I've worked with, and it is that, I don't know if you want to call it a point of acceptance or a point of transition,
Mhm.
where they are ready to let go, and there's a peacefulness that is just so profound, especially if you're in the room, watching that happen. It's observable but indescribable at the same time. It's really interesting. So you've done so much research, and I just love the bridge of where you are as a person and as a meditator and a scientist, and how you make that bridge for people. It's challenging, and you've done it in a way that, how has that affect what your life right now? And if you were like looking at your own transition onto the other side, how do you want that to be? How do you see that?
Well, that's an interesting question. And first of all, my own experiences in meditation, and of course, examining all of this beautiful research on near-death experiences and near-death awareness in persons in those final transition moments, has changed my total understanding of death. From before I began to meditate, I was one of those people that was frightened about it and didn't really want to think about it. And now I realize that it's just a transition to another state of awareness, and I don't feel I have anything to fear. And also, I've noticed that when I think about the fact that I was with my parents, both of them died of cancer over a prolonged period, and I was able to be with them at home for the last months of their lives. And we found a whole different relationship that we had never had before, that was deeper, closer, more loving, more intimate than we'd ever had before. And if I had missed that, I would have been so sad, because I think these moments open us up to a whole different level of being that is very, very beautiful in our relationships with our family. So, I mean, that's how I would love to die. And I also don't want to die in a hospital if at all possible. And I know that sometimes it has to happen, but I'm going to try to make it such that I can be at home surrounded by the people and the environment that I love, so that it will have that sense of the sacredness that I feel is part of this passing on to that next phase of our existence. And I think that, you know, we talk about public policy right now, and I think that one of the things I would suggest about public policy is that we need to actually begin to train our clinicians more carefully in end-of-life care. And I know we're working on that. It's beginning to happen, but I know the studies that actually are giving clinicians training in compassion meditation. And they find that those clinicians actually stay centered and loving in their work and don't get thrown off balance by some of the emergencies happening in the hospital. And they say that they don't have burnout because they have this understanding of the sacredness of their patients and what they're really doing with them. So I think that's really an important point to give us all more education in the peace and the beauty and the sacredness of our dying experience. And if our physicians and other healthcare workers can really be part of that, it will change our healthcare system, I think, in a beautiful, beautiful way.
You know, Marjorie, when you were talking about you've really desire to be at home and surrounded by your loved ones and not in an institution, you know, that's something that we really promote because 80% of the people actually, that's what they would prefer. Yet 60% of people over 65 die in a facility or a nursing home or ICU, something like that. And if people do preparation and planning while they're healthy and really put it in their paperwork and put it in, even looking at the space where they're living, you know, and preparing that space, you know, there needs to be more community nursing where people can, you know, here in Australia, community nursing is really big, you know, so I mean, it's the medical community can come in, and if there's any benefit to the COVID-19 situation, it's that telemedicine, you know, is going to be the mainstream, I hope. And there are people like Dr. Michael Fratkin that was doing this before COVID-19, but now he's like training people, you know, of how doctors how to do this. And I think if people prepare and make a conscious effort to do it, that can absolutely happen. And yeah, that's one of our goals, to support people to do that.
It's beautiful. And I want to say one other thing in terms of preparing for my own death. I went once to a beautiful workshop in New York City called the Art of Dying Workshop. And one of the things they mentioned was that we, if we have, for example, a terminal illness, can also help the people around us understand how we would like them to be. And one of the things they mentioned is when somebody comes to visit you, you might just have a sign on the door to ask the person to sit by the door for just 5 minutes to quiet down so they can come into being with you from this quiet, gentle space of mind. And I thought, I'm going to do that. That sounds like a great idea, so that we're in this place where they don't feel so anxious or sad per se, because they can be calm before they walk in to be.
That energy is so important. It really is. I've loved seeing you again, even if it's on Zoom and you're in Arizona, Sedona, Arizona, and I'm here in Australia, but it's great to see you again. And I just can't thank you enough for the work that you've done, you know, and how you've touched so many people on different sides of this issue. It makes such a huge difference.
Thank you.
Yeah, and if there are people that are listening to this podcast, is there a way that they could get in touch with you, a website or a way they could contact you?
Absolutely. So really, my website is simply my name, MarjorieWoollacott.com. And I imagine that someplace you may have that name on your webcast, so it'll be easy to see my name. So it's just adding.
We'll have a link there as well. And one of the things I love about your last name is it's 2 O's, 2 L's, 2 T's. Woollacott.
Yes.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, well, thank you so much for being with us today. And I hope you have you're going into your evening. Yeah, have a great evening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Bye.